They made me stand by the credenza like a hired hand while my brother, Brett, rehearsed his victory speech. My father snapped at me to straighten folders and stay invisible. Oblivious to the time. 7 minutes. That was how long until the firm's representative arrived to finalize the deal. They called this a celebration of family pride. But none of them realized the mysterious buyer they feared was already standing in the room, pouring their water. My name is Riley Adams, and I am 38 years old. Yet standing in this conference room, I felt exactly as small as I did when I was 12. I was dressed in a muted gray skirt suit that my mother, Marjorie, had specifically requested. She had called it appropriate support staff attire. She told me that today was about visual harmony, and that meant I needed to fade into the beige wallpaper of the executive suite. I adjusted my cuffs and resisted the urge to check the notification on my phone. I already knew what it said. The wire transfer was complete. The chess pieces were set. But to the 3 other people in this glass-walled aquarium of a room overlooking the Baltimore harbor, I was nothing more than a prop. My brother, Brett Langford, was pacing the length of the room like a tiger who had convinced himself the zoo was actually his jungle. He was wearing a navy bespoke suit that likely cost more than my first car, and he was practicing his handshake with the empty air. He stopped at the head of the mahogany table, planted his hands on the polished wood, and grinned at his reflection in the glass. He told us that this was it. He said he was finally taking his rightful place as the newest partner of Garnett and Rowe Capital. He looked the part. Brett always looked the part. That was the only thing he had ever truly excelled at. My father, Calvin, was sitting to the right of the empty chair reserved for the firm's representative. He looked at me with that familiar crinkle of disdain between his eyebrows. He snapped his fingers. A sharp, dry sound in the quiet room. He told me that my energy was wrong. He said I was hovering like a storm cloud and bringing the mood down. He pointed to the pitcher on the sideboard. He ordered me to pour the water, straighten the presentation folders, and then stay invisible. He told me that big business required a certain flow, and I was blocking it. I walked to the sideboard, my heels clicking softly on the carpet. I picked up the heavy crystal pitcher and poured water into the 4 glasses set out on the table. The ice clinked against the glass, and Brett winced. He told me to be careful. He said that distraction was the enemy of the close. He laughed then, a hollow, practice sound. He looked at Marjorie and said it was cute that they let me come. He asked me if I even understood what a capital buy-in was, or if I thought it was like paying the electric bill on my little apartment. I did not answer him. I placed the pitcher back on the silver tray and retreated to the corner, near the credenza. I slid my thumb under the cuff of my jacket and pressed the button on my watch to light up the face. 7 minutes. We had exactly 7 minutes until the firm's representative arrived to finalize Brett's partner seat. 7 minutes until the reality of the world crashed into the fantasy my family had constructed. Brett resumed his pacing. He was rehearsing his speech again, mumbling the words under his breath. He was talking about synergy and legacy and forward momentum. He sounded like a business school brochure that had been left out in the rain. He stopped in front of me, smoothing his silk tie. He told me that I should take notes today. He said I might learn something about how the real world operated. He told me that my safe, small life was fine for me, but some people were built for the stratosphere. He poked me in the shoulder, hard enough to leave a bruise but light enough to call it playful. He said he would buy me dinner afterwards. He said he would take us all to the most expensive steakhouse in D.C. because that is what partners do. Marjorie sighed from her seat. She was inspecting her manicure, ensuring no chip would ruin the aesthetic of the signing ceremony. She told Brett to leave me alone, but not out of kindness. She said that I should just be grateful I was allowed in the room at all. She looked at me with eyes that were cold and hard as flint. She said that winners belonged at the table, and spectators belonged in the stands. She told me to fix my posture because slouching made the whole family look weak. I straightened my spine. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I had practiced this expression for years. It was a mask of dull obedience. It was the face they expected, so it was the face I gave them. I stayed quiet because I had learned a long time ago that being underestimated is the cleanest kind of camouflage. If they thought I was stupid, they would speak freely. If they thought I was weak, they would not guard their flanks. If they thought I was irrelevant, they would not notice the gasoline I had been pouring around the foundation of their lives for the last 2 weeks. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that separated our conference room from the main lobby of the building. The office was bustling with analysts and associates, all moving with the frantic energy of high finance. But one figure cut through the noise like a scalpel. He was stepping off the elevator. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit with military precision. He carried a leather briefcase in his left hand, and his stride was calm, precise, and almost surgical. He did not look around at the architecture. He did not smile at the receptionist. He moved with the singular focus of a man who had a job to do and no interest in making friends. It was Vaughn Mercer. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it was not fear. It was the adrenaline of perfect timing. It was the thrill of seeing a complex mechanism click into gear exactly when it was supposed to. I checked my watch again. 1 minute early. Vaughn was always 1 minute early. Brett was still talking. He was telling Calvin that he was thinking of leasing a Porsche once the signing bonus cleared. Calvin was nodding, looking at his son with a mixture of desperate hope and pride. Marjorie was beaming, already spending the money in her head. They had no idea. They thought they were waiting for a coronation. They did not see the executioner walking down the hall. They did not know that the mysterious buyer who had acquired the controlling interest in the firm, the silent partner they had been whispering about nervously all morning, was not some faceless hedge fund manager in New York. The buyer was standing 5 feet away from them, holding a tray of water glasses, waiting for permission to speak. The door handle turned. The sound was loud in the sudden silence of the room. Brett spun around, flashing his brightest, most winning smile. Calvin stood up, buttoning his jacket to cover his paunch. Marjorie smoothed her skirt. I took a slow breath and clasped my hands behind my back. The show was about to begin. To understand why I was standing in that corner watching my family orchestrate their own demise, you have to understand how the Addams family ledger functioned. My father, Calvin, never really saw himself as a parent. He saw himself as a portfolio manager. To him, his children were asset classes, and he had decided decades ago how to allocate his resources. Brett was the high-growth bet, the volatile tech stock that promised massive returns if you just kept pumping capital into it. I was the low-return expense, the municipal bond that was boring, safe, and ultimately not worth the management fees. This dynamic was not subtle. It was the operating system of our entire lives, since we were teenagers. Brett's failures were treated as temporary setbacks in a grand visionary journey, while my successes were treated as anomalies that were best ignored. When Brett crashed his first car, Calvin bought him a newer one because a winner needed to project success to recover from a loss. When I made the dean's list, Marjorie asked me why I did not have a boyfriend yet, implying that my academic focus was a social liability. The financial disparity was staggering. Over the last 15 years, I had watched Calvin pour what must have been close to $500,000 into Brett's various fresh starts. There was an app development company that never produced a single line of code. Calvin called the $50,000 he lost on that venture seed funding. Then there was the luxury condo flip in Miami that went underwater in 6 months. Calvin covered the losses and called it a learning experience. They had a vocabulary for it. They called it bridge money. They called it stabilizing the foundation. They never called it what it actually was, which was lighting money on fire to keep Brett warm. I, on the other hand, had paid my own way through State University by working nights at a data entry center. I built my career quietly, brick by hard-earned brick, without a single introduction or handout from my father. I learned very quickly to stop asking this family to see me. It was easier to be invisible than to be dismissed. If I told them I had been promoted, Marjorie would frown and ask if that meant I would be working longer hours, as if my ambition was a personal inconvenience to her. Holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving and Christmas were essentially stage plays directed by Marjorie, where Brett starred as the conquering hero and I was cast as the supporting character who just did not get it. We would sit around the dining table, and Brett would spin these elaborate, inflated tales of his business conquests. He would talk about deals that were 90% done or networks he had penetrated. He would make little jokes about my risk-averse nature or my small life in a rented apartment. He would say things like, "Riley is the type who reads the terms and conditions." And everyone would laugh. They laughed to stay in his good graces. They laughed because if they stopped believing Brett was a genius, they would have to admit they had bet the family farm on a losing horse. Calvin openly measured love in numbers. It was his only currency. He did not care if you were happy. He cared about what you could earn, what you could impress upon others, and what you could buy. His affection was transactional. If Brett walked in with a new Italian watch, Calvin's eyes would light up. If I walked in with a book I loved, he would look at me with a vacant, glazed expression. To Calvin, value had to be tangible. It had to be something he could brag about at the country club. Marjorie was the enforcer of this delusion. She policed the family image with the ruthlessness of a dictator. In her mind, the narrative had to be preserved at all costs. The narrative was simple. Brett was the chosen one, the golden child destined for greatness. If I became too successful, if I outshined him, it ruined the story. It made Brett look bad. So, she actively suppressed me. She told relatives I was struggling when I was thriving. She minimized my job title. She critiqued my clothes. She did everything she could to keep me in the box marked support staff so that Brett could shine brighter by comparison. That brought us to the current crisis. 3 weeks ago, Brett had come to dinner with a manic light in his eyes. He announced that he had been recruited by Garnett and Rowe Capital. He dropped the name like it was Goldman Sachs, even though most people had never heard of it. He said they wanted him as a partner, not an associate, not a director, but a partner. The catch, which he explained with a lot of hand-waving and jargon, was that he needed to meet a capital verification requirement. He told Calvin that the firm required all new partners to show liquid access to a certain tier of capital to prove they had skin in the game. He made it sound like an exclusive club membership fee. He said it was standard for the big leagues. Calvin was hooked instantly. This was the validation he had been buying for 20 years. Finally, the market was seeing Brett the way Calvin saw Brett. Calvin was ready to pledge anything to keep this fantasy alive. He was ready to sign personal guarantees, leverage retirement accounts, and move assets around. He was so desperate for Brett to win that he stopped asking the basic questions a businessman of his tenure should have asked. He did not ask for the firm's audited financials. He did not ask for a list of current partners. He just saw the title, partner, and reached for his checkbook. But I did not. 2 weeks ago, when Brett had left a draft of the offer letter on the kitchen counter during Sunday brunch, I picked it up. I read it with the eyes of someone who analyzes distressed companies for a living. I did not see prestige. I saw a predatory lending structure dressed up in a suit. The language was vague. The buy-in clause was aggressive. The exit penalties were draconian. It was not a job offer. It was a liquidity trap. Garnett and Rowe were not recruiting talent. They were hunting for whales. They were looking for desperate men with rich fathers who would sign dangerous papers to buy a title. I recognized the setup immediately. It was a pressure cooker designed to extract wealth from families exactly like mine. Families where ego was stronger than logic. I could have warned them. I could have sat Calvin down and explained that the firm was over-leveraged and using new partner buy-ins to pay off old debts. I could have shown him that this was a Ponzi scheme with better letterhead, but I knew they would not listen. Marjorie would accuse me of being jealous. Brett would call me a saboteur. Calvin would tell me I did not understand how finance, so I did something else. I stopped being the daughter they ignored and started being the investor they never bothered to know. I decided that if they were determined to sell the family out, I would be the one on the other side of the transaction. I let them walk into the trap because it was the only way to break the cycle. I watched Calvin prepare to sign away his security for Brett's vanity, and I felt a strange clarity. They had spent a lifetime treating me like a bad investment. They were about to find out that I was the only one in the room who actually knew how to close a deal. Here is what my family never bothered to learn about me during all those years they spent talking over my head at dinner parties. I do not do administrative work. I do not manage calendars. And I do not color code filing cabinets for mid-level managers. I work in a very specific, very aggressive corner of the financial world known as special situations investing. It is a polite term for a brutal business. When companies wobble, when deals smell wrong to the average banker, when balance sheets start to sweat under the weight of bad decisions. Most people panic. They sell. They run. My world does not panic. It calculates. I spend my days sifting through the wreckage of corporate hubris, looking for the loose thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire sweater. I find the leverage points that nobody else sees, because they are too busy looking at the marketing brochures. My firm is called Rehearsed Strategies. You have likely never heard of it, and that is entirely by design. We do not have a flashy website with stock photos of people shaking hands in glass elevators. We do not sponsor golf tournaments. We are not famous, but we are lethal in the way we move. We operate in the shadows of the market, acquiring distressed debt, blocking positions, and controlling rights in companies that have lost their way. We are the people you call when you need to save a company, or when you need to dismantle one piece by piece. I had been tracking Garnett and Rowe Capital long before Brett brought their name up at the dinner table. They had popped up on my radar 6 months ago, not as a potential employer, but as a potential target. Their numbers did not add up. They were projecting massive growth, yet their cash flow was erratic. They were hiring partners at a rate that suggested they were not looking for talent. They were looking for liquidity. Their partner buy-in pipeline looked less like a recruitment strategy and more like a financial treadmill. They needed new money coming in the front door to pay off the obligations slipping out the back door. It was a classic structure for a firm on the brink of collapse. They were over-leveraged, drowning in operational debt, and banking on the vanity of people like my brother to keep the lights on. When I saw the offer letter on the kitchen counter 2 weeks ago, I did not view it as a family crisis to be solved with tears or arguments. I viewed it as due diligence. I could have warned Brett. I could have sat him down and drawn diagrams showing him that his buy-in capital would vanish into a black hole of pre-existing liabilities before the ink was dry on his signature, but I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He would call me paranoid, Calvin would call me jealous, Marjorie would tell me to stop being so negative. So, I decided to speak the only language they respected. I followed the money. I dug into Garnett and Rowe's debt structure. I found that they were servicing a massive credit facility that was currently in technical default. The lenders were nervous. They wanted out. They just needed someone willing to buy the paper at a discount and take on the headache of restructuring the firm. That is exactly what I did. 48 hours ago, while Brett was picking out his tie for this meeting and Calvin was liquidating his safe investments to fund the check, I was sitting in a quiet office in Delaware signing a stack of documents. Through a clean, opaque legal structure, Rehearsed Strategies acquired the controlling rights tied to Garnett and Rowe's senior secured obligations. The implications of that transaction were absolute. It meant that I did not just have leverage over the firm, I effectively had ownership of it. I held the keys to the castle. As the holder of the controlling debt, I had immediate board influence, compliance power, and hiring control. Technically, as of 2 days ago, every executive in that suite reported to my firm. The partners, the compliance officers, and the security teams were all operating under the umbrella of my authority. I arranged for today's signing to happen exactly as Brett wanted. I approved the schedule. I authorized the security clearance for Vaughn Mercer to be here. I set the stage for a big audience, a big ego, and a big trap. I wanted them to feel the full weight of the victory they thought they had won. I wanted Calvin to feel the pride swell in his chest. I wanted Marjorie to feel the vindication of her golden son taking the throne. I needed them to walk all the way to the edge of the cliff so that they would have no choice but to see the fall. The best part of the entire setup was the silence. They all insisted I stand in the corner. They made such a point of diminishing me, of turning me into a piece of furniture, that they rendered themselves blind. They were so busy looking at the reflection of their own success that they did not notice the person standing 5 feet away was the one holding the match. I watched Brett preen in the reflection of the window. I watched Calvin check his watch, impatient for his moment of glory. I watched Marjorie judge the thread count of the napkins. They thought I was there to serve them water. They had no idea that I was the one who had decided whether or not this building would even open its doors tomorrow morning. It is a strange sensation to hold the fate of your tormentors in your hands. It does not feel hot like anger. It feels cold. It feels heavy, like a stone you have carried for a very long time and are finally preparing to drop. I adjusted my glasses and smoothed the front of my skirt. I looked at the clock again. The timing was impeccable. Vaughn Mercer was walking down the hall because I had sent the email instructing him to be there. He was coming to execute a protocol that I had drafted. The trap was not just set. It was already sprung. They just had not heard the snap yet. And as I stood there, invisible and underestimated, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not waiting for my family to accept me. I was waiting to see if they could survive me. The door to the conference room opened without a sound, swinging inward on heavy, well-oiled hinges. Vaughn Mercer stepped across the threshold, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees instantly. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and neutral colors, dressed in a charcoal suit that was impeccably tailored but entirely devoid of personality. He did not look like a man who was here to welcome a new partner into the fold. He looked like a man who was here to foreclose on a mortgage. He carried a slim black tablet under one arm and nothing else. There were no balloons, no welcome packet, and certainly no champagne. He walked to the head of the table with a stride that was unhurried and deliberate. He placed the tablet on the mahogany surface, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the table, and finally looked up. Brett was already standing, his hand extended, wearing a smile that was too wide and too eager. "Vaughn, great to finally meet you in person," Brett said, his voice booming a little too loudly in the acoustically dampened room. "I've heard great things about the compliance team." Vaughn looked at Brett's hand for a fraction of a second before taking it. He did not smile. He did not pump the hand or clap Brett on the shoulder. He simply took Brett's hand in his own and held it there, motionless. It was not a greeting. It was an assessment. He was shaking Brett's hand the way a butcher weighs a cut of meat, calculating density and value. "Mr. Langford," Vaughn said. His voice was a flat, dry baritone. "We have a tight schedule today." He released Brett's hand and turned his attention to the rest of the room. My father, Calvin, had already risen from his chair, buttoning his jacket in an attempt to assert his usual dominance. He stepped forward, radiating the kind of aggressive charm that had worked on country club boards and local zoning committees for 40 years. "Calvin Adams," my father said, thrusting his hand out. "We are all very proud of Brett. It is a big day for the family. I assume we can wrap up the formalities quickly? We have a lunch reservation at 2 o'clock. Vaughn did not take my father's hand. Instead, he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, his movements economical and precise. "The duration of the meeting depends entirely on the verification process." "Mr. Adams," Vaughn said, ignoring the introduction. "Garnett and Rowe operates under strict regulatory frameworks. Partner onboarding is a regulated process, not a ceremonial one. Please, take a seat." Calvin blinked, his smile faltering for a moment before he covered it with a stiff chuckle. He sat down slowly, clearly unused to being given orders in a room he was paying for. The power dynamic had shifted in 10 seconds, and everyone felt it except perhaps Marjorie. My mother was watching the exchange with a pinched expression. She did not like the tone Vaughn was taking, but she had no way to intervene. Her eyes darted around the table and landed on me. She raised her hand and snapped her fingers twice. The sound was sharp and dismissive, like a crack of a whip. "Riley," she hissed. "The water." "Mr. Mercer's glass is empty." She looked at me with pure annoyance, treating me like a malfunctioning appliance that needed a kick. I did not react. I did not roll my eyes. I simply stepped forward from the shadows of the corner, lifted the pitcher, and poured water into Vaughn's glass. I placed it on a coaster to his right. Vaughn did not look at me or thank me. To him, I was exactly what I appeared to be. Invisible support staff. That was perfect. Brett remained standing for a moment too long, then awkwardly sat down. He reached for the leather portfolio he had placed on the table earlier. It was a beautiful piece of Italian leather, embossed with his initials. He opened it with a dramatic flair, acting like he was already wearing the partner title, trying to reclaim the energy in the room. "I have everything right here," Brett said, tapping a stack of crisp documents. "Signed offer letter, capital commitment forms, and the bank letters. We are ready to rock and roll." I was standing just behind and to the left of Brett, and from my vantage point, I saw what the others missed. As Brett's hand rested on the paper, his index finger was vibrating. It was a tiny, rhythmic tremor. He tried to hide it by making a fist and resting his hand on the table, but the tension was radiating off him in waves. He was terrified. He was playing the part of the confident executive, but his body knew he was walking a wire without a net. Vaughn barely glanced at the papers. He tapped the screen of his tablet, his eyes scanning data that none of us could see. "Physical documents are a good start. Mr. Langford," Vaughn said without looking up, "but for a buy-in of this magnitude, we require real-time confirmation. We need clean verification of the funds directly from the source institution. The regulatory environment has changed significantly in the last 6 months. We cannot rely on printouts. They can be altered." The word hung in the air. Altered. Brett's laugh was brittle. "Altered? Come on. Vaughn, these are from the bank. I picked them up this morning." "Standard procedure," Vaughn said, finally locking eyes with Brett. "We have a clearing window that closes in 45 minutes, and I should mention, we have a second candidate waiting in the lobby." The air left the room. Brett's smile cracked. It didn't just fade, it shattered. "A second candidate?" The offer letter said, "Exclusive negotiation." "Exclusive until the point of failure," Vaughn corrected him coldly. "If the capital verification does not clear within the window, the board has instructed me to move to the alternate candidate immediately. We have a fiduciary duty to fill the seat before the quarter closes." Calvin leaned forward, his face reddening. "Now wait a minute. We have a deal. You can't just—" "We have a conditional offer. Mr. Adams," Vaughn cut him off, "conditioned on verified capital. If the money is there, you have nothing to worry about. If it is not, we move on." The silence that followed was suffocating. Brett was staring at Vaughn, his mouth slightly open. He looked like a deer staring down the headlights of a semi-truck. He knew his printouts were fluffed. He knew the money in the account wasn't fully liquid, or perhaps wasn't even fully his. He had counted on a handshake and a grace period. He hadn't counted on a competitor in the lobby. This was the moment, the pivot point. I took a half step forward, clasping my hands in front of me with the kind of helpful, non-threatening posture that people mistake for weakness. My voice was soft, apologetic, the voice of a sister trying to help her brother out of a jam. "Excuse me," I said. Everyone looked at me. Calvin looked furious that I was speaking. Marjorie looked ready to drag me out by my ear. Brett looked confused. "I am sorry to interrupt," I said, keeping my eyes on the table. "But if time is an issue and you need real-time verification, maybe we could just do a direct login? The secure portal?" I looked at Brett with wide, innocent eyes. "You used the portal last time, remember, Brett? To show Dad the balance? If you just log in right here, Mr. Mercer can see the live balance on the screen. It would be instant. No waiting for banks to call back. That would settle it, right?" I turned to Vaughn. He looked at me for the first time. His expression unreadable, though I knew exactly what he was thinking because I had written the script. "A direct portal view would be acceptable," Vaughn said. "It is the fastest way to satisfy compliance." He pushed his tablet toward the center of the table. "If you can authenticate right now. Mr. Langford, we can finalize this in 5 minutes and send the other candidate home." Brett looked at the tablet, then he looked at me. For a second, I saw a flash of panic so raw it was almost painful to watch. He was cornered. If he refused, he looked like a fraud and lost the seat to the mystery candidate. If he agreed, he had to expose the actual state of his finances to the room. "Right," Brett said, his voice straining to sound casual. "Yeah, the portal. Good idea. Riley?" He glared at me, a mixture of hatred and desperation. He thought I was an idiot who had accidentally put him on the spot. He didn't realize I had just handed him a shovel and pointed to the soft earth at his feet. "Great," I said, stepping back to the credenza. "I will just stand here out of the way while you log in." Brett reached for the tablet. His hand was shaking so badly now that he had to use his other hand to steady it. The trap was set. All he had to do was type his password. The air in the conference room seemed to vibrate with a frequency that only I could hear. It was the hum of a trap snapping shut, metal grinding against bone. Though no one else had realized they were bleeding yet, Brett pulled his hand back from the tablet I had offered, rejecting the direct login with a sharp, jerky motion. He laughed, but the sound had no mirth in it. It was a dry hacking noise that bounced off the glass walls. He told Vaughn that he could not log into the portal right now because he had left his security token at his office downtown. He claimed the two-factor authentication would take too long to reset, and they did not want to waste everyone's time with tech support. Instead, he shoved the leather portfolio across the mahogany table again. He insisted that he had the numbers ready in hard copy. He tapped the thick cream-colored paper with his index finger. He said these were certified summaries from the bank, printed this morning, and they were polished enough to fool anyone who was just glancing at the bottom line. He looked at Calvin for support, and my father nodded vigorously, confusing the thickness of the paper with the weight of the truth. Vaughn did not touch the folder. He did not even look at it. He kept his eyes locked on Brett's face. He calmly stated that the firm did not accept a physical chain of custody for capital verification. He said that paper could be forged, edited, or outdated the moment it left the printer. He explained that in the current regulatory climate, accepting a printout was equivalent to negligence. Vaughn leaned back slightly in his chair, a move that signaled he was prepared to walk away. He requested the original digital file of the statement Brett was referencing to be sent immediately through the firm's official secure channel. He said it was a simple requirement. If the documents in the folder were real, then the digital file that generated them must exist on Brett's laptop, which was sitting closed on the table in front of him. Brett hesitated. It was a pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long. It was the hesitation of a man standing on a diving board who suddenly realizes there might not be water in the pool. He knew that handing over a piece of paper was one thing. Lying on a physical page could be argued as a clerical error. But sending a digital file through a secure compliance server was different. That created a digital fingerprint. That was wire fraud. That was intent. He looked at Vaughn. Then he looked at the door where the imaginary second candidate was supposedly waiting. The pressure was hydraulic. It was crushing him from all sides. Brett forced another laugh. This one louder and more desperate. He said no problem. He said he would send the file right now. He opened his laptop, his movements stiff and jerky. I stepped forward from the credenza, my voice helpful and mild. I told him I would provide the secure address to make sure it went to the right queue. I recited the email address for the compliance intake server, a server that I had personally configured 48 hours ago. I held up my own tablet to show him the address, acting like I was doing him a massive favor by ensuring his application didn't get lost in the shuffle. Brett typed the address. I watched his eyes dart across the screen. He was attaching the file I knew he had doctored. He was committing to the lie, under the table. His knee was bouncing so hard it was shaking the water glass I had poured for him. The ice cubes chimed softly, a tiny distress signal that only I noticed. He hit send. He looked up, flashing a smile that was all teeth and panic. He said it was sent. He leaned back, trying to look relaxed, trying to embody the casual arrogance of a man with nothing to hide, but he looked like he was vibrating out of his skin. A second later, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my blazer. It was a single, short vibration. To anyone else, it was just a notification. To me, it was the sound of the cage door locking. The document had landed exactly where I wanted it. It was not just in Vaughn's inbox. It was in my custody. I had the metadata. I had the timestamps. I had proof of the fabrication. Vaughn checked his own tablet. He did not praise Brett. He did not say thank you. He simply noted that the file had been received and was being processed by the automated verification system. He said there was a clearing window of approximately 1 hour before the funds would be fully certified for the partnership lock-in. Calvin let out a long breath. Thinking the hurdle was cleared, he reached for his water, his hand steady again. He started to say something about champagne, but Vaughn cut him off. Vaughn said that because of the clearing window, and to secure the seat against the other candidate immediately, there was a standard collateral step required for same-day lock-in. Calvin stiffened. He froze with the glass halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. He said he did not understand. He said collateral was not part of the discussion. He looked at Brett, his eyes narrowing. Brett looked away, studying the grain of the wood table. Collateral was definitely not part of the fantasy Brett had pitched him. Brett had promised a clean entry, a simple buy-in, a victory lap. Vaughn ignored the tension. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Calvin. He spoke with the flat indifference of a bureaucrat. He said that until the digital verification was 100% complete, the firm required a personal guarantee to hold the equity position. He said it was a bridge guarantee, temporary but necessary to prove liquidity and intent. Calvin picked up the paper. I watched his face pale. Vaughn had not asked for a guarantee on a bank account or a stock portfolio. I had instructed Vaughn to ask for the one thing that defined Calvin Adams's sense of self-worth. The agreement required a lien on the St. Michael's estate. It was a waterfront property that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was the place where Calvin held his summer parties. It was the place he talked about when he wanted to impress strangers. It was not just an asset. It was his identity. It was the physical manifestation of the Adams legacy. Calvin stared at the paper. His hands were shaking now, mirroring Brett's tremor from moments ago. He looked at Vaughn and said this was highly irregular. He said the house was not liquid capital. It was a family home. Vaughn did not blink. He said that for a partner-level buy-in, they needed substantial security. He said that if the funds Brett had just submitted were verified as authentic, the lien would be dissolved in 24 hours. It would be a ghost, a formality that vanished by tomorrow morning. Vaughn paused, and then delivered the line I had scripted for him. He looked Calvin in the eye and asked if there was any reason to doubt that the funds would clear. The room went dead silent. The question hung there like a guillotine blade. If Calvin refused to sign, he was admitting he did not trust his son. If he signed, he was putting his most prized possession on the roulette table. I watched Brett. He was not looking at his father. He was staring at the table, his face gray. He knew the funds wouldn't clear. He knew the collateral would be seized. But he couldn't say a word. If he spoke now, he would have to confess to everything, the lies, the fake documents, the debt. So he stayed silent. He let his father hold the pen. He let the trap spring. Calvin held the pen like it was a weapon he did not know how to use. He looked at the document, then at Vaughn, and finally at the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall. The silence in the room was heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a verdict. He tossed the pen onto the table, where it clattered loudly against the mahogany. He told Vaughn that this was ridiculous. He said that he had been doing business in this state for 40 years, and he had never been asked to collateralize a personal residence for a corporate employment agreement. He tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous bark. He looked around the room, seeking an ally, but finding only the cold, impassive face of the man I had hired to dismantle his ego. Vaughn did not blink. He did not shift in his seat. He simply tapped his finger on the single sheet of paper. He told Calvin that this was routine for accelerated onboarding. He explained that when a partner asks to bypass the standard 30-day vetting period, to lock in a seat immediately, the firm requires security. He said it was a simple equation of risk and reward. If the capital was real, the line was a phantom. If the capital was not real, the firm needed protection. Calvin opened his mouth to argue, likely to cite his reputation or his golf handicap or some other irrelevant metric of his status. But Brett cut him off. Brett leaned in hard, his chest hovering over the table. He looked at his father with eyes that were wide and wet with panic. He told Calvin that it was just for one day. He pleaded with him not to ruin this. He said that everything was lined up and they were at the finish line. He whispered that he had already told people. He said he had already updated his LinkedIn profile. He was begging, not like a partner, but like a child who had broken a vase and needed the evidence hidden before the parents got home. Calvin hesitated. I watched the war play out on his face. It was a battle between his survival instinct, which screamed that signing a lien on his home was insanity, and his pride, which refused to admit that his son might be a liability. Marjorie saw the hesitation too, and because she could not attack the man in the charcoal suit, and she would not attack her golden son, she turned her sights on the only available target, me. She turned in her chair, her jewelry rattling with the sudden movement. She glared at me standing by the credenza. She hissed that I was doing this. She said I was bad luck. She told me to stop staring at them because I was jinxing the deal. She spoke as if my very existence was a contaminant in the air, a spiritual pollutant that was souring their luck. She asked why I was even still here, standing like a vulture. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I held her gaze with a calm neutrality that I knew infuriated her. I wanted to tell her that luck had nothing to do with it. I wanted to tell her that this was not bad fortune. It was accounting. But I stayed silent. I let her hate me. It made what was coming next easier. I watched Calvin. I saw the moment his pride won the wrestling match against his fear. It always did. He could not tolerate the idea of walking out of this room as a failure. He could not tolerate the idea of the other candidate in the lobby taking Brett's spot. He convinced himself that the risk was zero because he believed the lie. He believed they were winners, and winners do not lose their houses. He picked up the pen again. His hand hovered over the signature line. The tip of the pen trembled slightly, casting a small, shaky shadow on the paper. Brett let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 minutes. Marjorie clasped her hands together in a prayer of greed. The pen touched the paper. The ink began to flow. Buzz. The sound of a phone vibrating against the hard wood of the table cut through the room like a gunshot. It was not my phone this time. It was Vaughn's. Vaughn did not ignore it. He did not apologize. He glanced down at the screen of his phone, read the message, and then placed his hand flat over the document Calvin was signing. He told them to stop. Calvin froze, the pen dragging a jagged line of ink across the bottom of the page. He looked up, confused and irritated. He asked what was wrong now. Vaughn picked up the paper and slid it away from Calvin, out of reach. He said that before they proceeded, there was an addendum. He said the situation had changed in the last 30 seconds. He looked toward the double doors of the conference room. The handle turned, the door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was striking. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer that looked like armor, she carried a thick accordion folder, and her expression was one of absolute, unyielding professional severity. She did not look like a receptionist or an assistant. She looked like the person you hire when you want to burn a village down legally. Her name was Alyssa Kerr. I had introduced her to the team 48 hours ago as outside counsel for the restructuring review, but Brett knew her from a different life. I watched Brett's face. The color did not just drain from it, it vanished. His eyes locked onto Alyssa, and for a split second, the mask of the corporate partner fell away completely, revealing the terrified con artist beneath. He recognized her. He knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, he knew that she had no business being in a meeting at Garnett and Rowe. Alyssa walked to the table, her heels clicking with a rhythmic, predatory cadence. She did not shake hands. She did not introduce herself to Calvin or Marjorie. She stood next to Vaughn and placed her folder on the table. She spoke quietly, but her voice carried to every corner of the room. She stated that she was acting as special counsel for the firm's compliance division. She said that they had just received a system-wide alert related to the document submission Mr. Langford had sent 2 minutes ago. Brett stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He tried to smile, but his lips were twitching. He asked what she was talking about. He asked if there was a technical glitch. He tried to sound authoritative, but his voice cracked. Alyssa did not look at his face. She looked at his hands, which were gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. She said it was not a glitch. She said that the firm's automated verification system had flagged the digital file for inconsistencies in the metadata. She said that before any contracts could be signed, and certainly before any collateral could be accepted, they needed to ask one clarifying question. She opened her folder. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, a printout of the digital file Brett had just emailed. She turned the paper around so it faced Brett. She asked him to confirm, for the record, that he was the sole author of this document and that the figures contained within it were pulled directly from a live banking server. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was not really a question. It was a trapdoor. If he said yes, he was on the record committing fraud. If he said no, he was admitting he had lied. Calvin looked at Alyssa, then at Brett. He started to ask who this woman was, but the look on Brett's face stopped him cold. Calvin had seen his son make mistakes before. He had seen him drunk. He had seen him high, and he had seen him desperate. But he had never seen him look like this. Brett looked like a man who had just heard the jail cell door click shut. I watched from my corner, my hands clasped behind my back. Marjorie glared at me again, her eyes demanding that I fix this, that I get more water, that I make the bad people go away. But I did not move. The water in the pitcher was still. The time for service was over. The time for the verdict had begun. Alyssa Kerr did not blink. She held the paper like a shield, creating a physical barrier between Brett's fantasy and the cold reality of the room. She asked him again, her voice devoid of any inflection, to confirm out loud that the submission was accurate and personally certified by him. She told him that for the record, he needed to state that he had not altered, edited, or fabricated the data contained in the file he had just sent to the compliance server. The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit in the ceiling. Brett looked at the paper, then at Alyssa, and then he tried to do what he had done his entire life. He tried to charm his way out of a bear trap. He let out a short, incredulous laugh and leaned back in his chair, spreading his hands wide. He said that this felt like an interrogation over a typo. He told Alyssa that she was being very intense for Thursday morning. He looked around the table, his eyes darting to Calvin and then to Vaughn, trying to build a coalition of reasonable men against this uptight woman. He said that obviously the numbers were right, give or take a rounding error, and asked if they could just move past the red tape and get to the champagne, but nobody laughed. Calvin did not chuckle. Vaughn did not smile. Alyssa did not move the paper. The joke died in the air, suffocating under the weight of the silence. Brett's smile froze, then slowly curdled into a grimace of confusion. He realized, perhaps for the first time in 40 years, that his charisma had no currency here. Vaughn reached out and rotated the large monitor that sat at the end of the table so it faced the group. He did not speak with anger. He spoke with the clinical detachment of a coroner explaining a cause of death. He said that the system flags were not regarding rounding errors. On the screen, a series of red cascading lines highlighted the metadata of Brett's file. Vaughn pointed to the timestamps. He explained that the file Brett had just sent, the one he claimed was a live download from a banking server, had actually been created 18 hours ago using a PDF editing suite. He pointed to the author tag in the digital footprint. It did not say First National Bank. It said Brett Langford's MacBook Pro. Vaughn said that the inconsistencies showed clear modification of the balance fields. He said it was not a clerical error. It was a manual override. He showed enough to prove intent without turning the meeting into a tutorial on how to commit fraud. He simply laid the corpse of Brett's lie on the table and let it rot in the open air. Brett went the color of old ash. The blood drained from his face so fast, it looked like a physical reaction to a blow. He slumped in his chair, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He turned his head slowly toward Calvin, his eyes wide and pleading, looking for the rescue that always came. He was waiting for his father to write a check, make a call, or shout at someone until the problem went away. But Calvin looked like the floor had moved under him. He was staring at the monitor, reading the words modification and fabrication. He understood what those words meant. He understood that this wasn't something he could fix with a donation or a handshake. He looked at his son, and for the first time, I saw the reflection of the golden child shatter in his eyes. He saw a liar who had almost cost him his home. Marjorie, however, refused to accept the signal. She looked at the screen, then at Brett's pale face, and her mind rejected the data. She slammed her hand down on the table, her rings clattering against the wood. She announced loudly that this was a misunderstanding. She said it was clearly a technical glitch. She looked at Vaughn with pure venom and told him his machines were broken. Then, inevitably, she turned on me. She pointed a manicured finger at the corner where I stood. She said that I must have distracted him. She said that I had been hovering and sending bad energy, and that I had probably confused him while he was trying to work. She demanded that I apologize to Brett for ruining his focus. She tried to rewrite history in real time, desperate to make me the villain so Brett could remain the victim. That was the moment. I did not apologize. I did not look down. I did not refill anyone's water glass. I stepped away from the credenza. The movement was slow, deliberate, and heavy. I walked out of the shadow of the corner and into the light of the main room. I walked past Marjorie, who was still sputtering accusations. I walked past Calvin, who was staring at the table in shock. I walked past Brett, who looked like he was about to be sick. I walked to the head of the table. Vaughn stood up immediately and stepped aside, offering me the chair. He did it with deference, with the respect due to a superior. The room froze. Marjorie stopped talking mid-sentence. Calvin looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. Brett looked at Vaughn, then at me. Unable to process the visual information, they were waiting for someone to tell me to sit back down. They were waiting for me to be reprimanded. I stood behind the head chair, placing my hands on the leather backrest. I looked at them. My mother, my father, my brother. They looked so small from this angle. I pulled a slender cable from the center console of the table and connected my own device to the display system. The screen flickered once, wiping away the evidence of Brett's fraud, and replaced it with a new image. It was a corporate organizational chart. At the top, in bold, crisp letters, was the name Rehearsed Strategies. Below it, connected by a solid line of ownership, was Garnett and Rowe Capital. And below that, the list of executive officers. I opened one file, the ownership and control documentation tied to Rehearsed acquisition rights. It showed the purchase of the debt, the transfer of board control, and the signatories. The signature at the bottom of the acquiring document was not a mystery. It was mine, Riley Adams, Managing Director. I let them read it. I let the silence stretch until it was tight enough to snap a neck. Then I spoke. My voice was not the soft, apologetic murmur of the daughter who pours the water. It was the steel-hard voice of the woman who owns the building. Mr. Mercer does not work for Garnett and Rowe today, I said, my voice cutting through the room evenly. He works for me. Calvin's mouth fell open. Marjorie looked like she had been slapped. Brett made a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. I looked directly at Brett. I looked at the tremor in his hands, the sweat on his forehead, the cheapness of his suit that he thought was expensive. I looked at the brother who had spent a lifetime making me feel small so he could feel tall. You thought you were here to sign a partnership agreement, I said. You thought you were here to collect a title you didn't earn. I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the table, claiming the space that they had told me I didn't belong in. This meeting isn't your promotion, I said. delivering the sentence I had waited 38 years to say, "It is your evaluation." And as I watched the realization hit them, as I watched the horror dawn on my mother's face and the absolute devastation collapse my brother's posture, I felt a calm so profound it was almost spiritual. The camouflage was gone. The invisible girl was the only one left standing. Brett's reaction was immediate and volcanic. The shock of seeing my name on the organizational chart metabolized instantly into rage. He slammed his hand on the table, knocking over the water glass I had filled for him 10 minutes earlier. The water soaked into the cuffs of his expensive suit, but he did not notice. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was sick. He accused me of planning this entire charade because I was jealous. He shouted that I had always been jealous of him, that I was bitter because I was invisible, and that I was trying to ruin the family just to make myself feel important. It was the usual script. It was the same tantrum he threw when he was 16 and I got better grades, or when he was 25 and I got a promotion. Whenever the golden child is cornered, he accuses the walls of closing in on him out of spite. Calvin joined the fray, his face a mottled red. He stood up and slammed his palms against the table, demanding that I stop this nonsense immediately. He used his father's voice, the one that was supposed to make waiters scurry and children tremble. He told me to turn off the screen. He told me to apologize to Mr. Mercer. He acted as if he could still command reality just by raising his volume decibels. He thought this was a living room argument that he could end by sending me to my room. I let them scream. I let the noise wash over me like bad weather. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, flanked by Vaughn and Alyssa, who watched the display with professional disinterest. When Brett finally ran out of breath and Calvin paused to cough, I spoke. I told them that they needed to listen very carefully because the situation had moved past family dynamics and into criminal liability. I explained that what Brett had just done was not a prank, and it was not a mistake. I pointed to the screen where the metadata logs were still displayed. I told them that attempting to pass off a fabricated financial document to a regulated firm for the purpose of securing equity was fraud. I told them it created an exposure that went far beyond this room. It could trigger external investigations. It could invite lawsuits from the firm's other creditors. It could lead to a total financial collapse of the family estate if the authorities decided to follow the money trail back to Calvin's accounts. Calvin went quiet. The word investigations has a way of silencing men who have spent a lifetime cutting corners. I did not stop there. I tapped my tablet, and the screen changed again. This time, it showed a timeline. It was a disaster. I revealed that I had documented patterns going back 5 years. I walked them through the history they thought they had buried. I showed the wire transfers for the Miami condo flip that never happened. I showed the bailouts for the tech startup that did not exist. I showed the dates where Calvin had signed personal guarantees to cover Brett's losses, effectively laundering his own failures through his father's credit. I showed the emails where Marjorie had instructed accountants to reclassify personal debts as business expenses to protect the family image. I looked at Marjorie. I told her that she had spent decades policing the family reputation, protecting appearances over truth. I told her that today. The truth had finally outrun her. I explained that in the world of high finance, appearances are worthless without the liquidity to back them up. Brett tried to interrupt, sputtering something about context, but I cut him off. I told them that I was not here for revenge. I told them I was here for resolution. I said that despite everything, I was holding the only clean exit they were going to get. I told them that I was the firewall standing between them and a federal indictment. I laid out the options. They were binary. They were stark. And they were non-negotiable. Option 1. They could cooperate with the restructuring terms I had prepared. This meant accepting that the partnership offer was void. It meant agreeing to a strict repayment plan for the debts Calvin had incurred on Brett's behalf. It meant that I would take over the management of the family trust to ensure that what was salvageable remained protected. It was a path that saved their home, saved their reputation in the community, and prevented escalation. Option 2. They could fight me. They could deny everything. They could try to sue Renhold Strategies. I told them that if they chose this path, I would step back and let compliance follow the trail wherever it leads. I would hand the metadata from today's meeting over to the regulators. I would release the hold on the debt obligations. I would let the machinery of the law grind them down until there was nothing left but legal fees and regret. I looked at Brett and asked him if he really wanted a forensic accountant looking at his hard drive. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Marjorie began to cry. It was a sudden theatrical sobbing that I had seen 100 times before. She reached for a handkerchief and looked at me with tear-filled eyes. She tried emotional blackmail. She wailed that she could not believe her own daughter would do this to them. She said that after all they had done for me, after they gave me life and a home, this was how I repaid them. She tried to use shame as a weapon. She tried to pull the strings of guilt that had controlled me for 30 years. But the strings were cut. Her tears landed flat. They looked like a performance, not a tragedy. I watched her cry, and I felt absolutely nothing but a mild impatience. I had outgrown the spell. I waited for her to finish her sentence, and then I spoke with a clarity that cut through the sobbing. I told her that we were not discussing gratitude. We were discussing solvency. I told her that shame was not a currency that the bank accepted. I set the boundaries like contracts. I made them clear, specific, and unemotional. I told Calvin that he was no longer allowed to sign financial documents on Brett's behalf without my countersignature. I told Brett that he was removed from any decision-making capacity regarding the family assets effective immediately. I told Marjorie that the days of using me as a scapegoat to cover up their dysfunction were over. I told them that this was how we ended the cycle. I explained that chaos feeds on silence and enabling, and I was turning on the lights. Calvin looked at the lean document still sitting on the table. He looked at Brett, who was staring at his shoes. Defeated, he looked at me, standing at the head of the table, holding the power he thought was his birthright. He realized then that he had no choice. The patriarch was dead. The investor had taken over, and for the first time in his life, he had to negotiate with his daughter, not as a parent, but as a subordinate. I slid a new document across the table. It was a settlement agreement. I told them to read it. I told them they had 10 minutes to decide whether they wanted to be a family that survived a hard day, or a cautionary tale on the evening news. Brett looked at the settlement agreement lying on the table, and then he looked at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to sign it. I thought the weight of the evidence had finally crushed the delusion out of him, but I had underestimated the survival instinct of a narcissist who has never been told no. Brett did not pick up the pen. Instead, he lunged for his phone. He stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward, crashing onto the floor with a sound like a gunshot. He pointed his phone at me like a weapon, his thumb hovering over the screen. He started screaming that I was the one committing fraud. He yelled that I had hacked his laptop, that I had planted the files, and that this was a setup designed to steal his equity. He looked at Calvin, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and claimed that I was orchestrating a hostile takeover to push the family out. He threatened to call the authorities. He threatened to call the press. He said he would have reporters in the lobby in 10 minutes to expose me as a corporate saboteur. It was a desperate, flailing power move. It was the last play in the playbook of a man who has no cards left. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my position at the head of the table. I simply tapped the screen of the main display one more time. I told the room to look at the monitor. The screen displayed a detailed, forensic timeline of the document's creation. I walked them through the chain of custody. I showed the exact second the request for the file was sent from Vaughn's secure server. I showed the IP address that received the request. It matched the device currently sitting in front of Brett. I showed the timestamp of when the file was modified. And most damning of all, I showed the user log. The modification hadn't happened remotely. It had happened locally, on Brett's machine. 5 minutes before he walked into this room, I spoke calmly. I told Brett that he was welcome to call the police. I told him that I would be happy to hand this entire digital packet over to the district attorney myself. I asked him if he really wanted to explain to a federal prosecutor why his digital fingerprints were all over a forged banking instrument. Brett stared at the screen. The reality of the numbers stared back at him, unblinking and irrefutable. He looked at the door. I saw the muscle in his jaw jump. He was calculating the distance. He tried to bolt. He shoved past his chair and made a break for the exit, moving with the clumsy speed of a panicked animal. He didn't even make it 3 steps. Vaughn did not tackle him. There was no dramatic scuffle. Vaughn simply took one large step to the left, blocking the path with his broad shoulders. He stood there like a wall of charcoal wool. Brett pulled up short, almost colliding with him. Vaughn looked down at him and stated flatly that leaving the room during a compliance lockdown would be considered an admission of guilt and would trigger an immediate call to the marshals. Brett froze. He looked back at Calvin, panting. Calvin turned on me with sudden, vicious venom. He shouted my name. He asked me how I could do this to my own brother. He accused me of entrapment. He tried to frame my competence as cruelty, but then he looked at Brett, who was shaking and cornered, and the venom turned into panic. Calvin realized that his anger at me would not fix the metadata on the screen. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the stranger he had raised. He realized he had nowhere to put the blame without drowning alongside him. That was when Alyssa Kerr decided to twist the knife. She stepped forward, opening the second section of her file. She said that there was one more thing the family needed to understand before they decided whether to sign the settlement. She revealed the twist that even I had not fully anticipated until the diligence came back yesterday. She told them that Brett was not just trying to qualify for the partnership for the sake of prestige. She said he was using the partner process to hide a separate mess. Alyssa laid out the details. Brett had been managing a private investment vehicle for 3 of Calvin's oldest friends, men who trusted Calvin with their lives. Brett had told them he was getting them into a pre-IPO tech deal. The money was gone. He had lost it 6 months ago on bad options trades. The capital buy-in for Garnett and Rowe was not his money. He had been planning to use the partner signing bonus and the access to the firm's credit lines to pay back Calvin's friends before they realized their accounts were empty. The room went dead. Calvin went white. This was not just a bad business deal. This was social suicide. This was the kind of betrayal that ended friendships and started criminal investigations. Brett had built a bomb that was going to detonate not just on the firm, but on Calvin's entire social circle. Brett looked at the floor, unable to deny it. Then, the sound of a purse snapping shut broke the silence. Marjorie was sitting very straight, her face a mask of brittle porcelain. She spoke softly. She said she knew he didn't have the money. We all looked at her. Marjorie admitted that Brett had come to her 2 days ago and told her he was short. She did not know about the theft from Calvin's friends, but she knew he was faking the buy-in capital. She said she told him to go ahead with it anyway. She admitted that she thought if they just got him in the door, if they just got the title, they could figure out the money later. She looked at me with cold, hard eyes and said she thought that if she bullied me enough, if she made me feel small enough, I would stay in my corner and not interfere with the process. She had gambled the family's future on the assumption that I was too weak to stop them. The circular firing squad began immediately. Brett turned on Marjorie. He shouted that she had pushed him. He screamed that she was the one who told him he had to be a partner by 40 or he was a failure. He threw her under the bus without a second thought, claiming he only did it to satisfy her obsession with status. Marjorie gasped and threw Calvin under the bus. She yelled that she only pushed Brett because Calvin was so critical, because Calvin only loved winners, and she was trying to protect her son from his father's disappointment. Calvin tried to bargain with everyone at once. He looked at Brett and called him a thief. He looked at Marjorie and called her an enabler. He looked at me and begged me to bury the part about his friend's money. He was spinning, trying to plug the leaks in a boat that had already split in half. I stood there and let them spiral. I let them scream. I let the ugly, raw truth spill out onto the mahogany table. I let them say the things they had been thinking for 20 years. I did not intervene. I did not calm them down. Sometimes the truth needs room to show its shape, and its shape is often hideous. I watched them tear each other apart, and I felt the last lingering threads of obligation snap. These people were not my burden to carry. They were drowning, and they were trying to climb on top of each other to breathe. After 3 minutes of chaos, I nodded to Vaughn. Vaughn cleared his throat. The sound was authoritative enough to cut through the shouting match. He announced the board action. He stated that effective immediately, Garnett and Rowe Capital were operating under new control terms. He said that due to the attempted fraud and the breach of compliance protocols, the offer of partnership extended to Brett Langford was formally rescinded. He looked at Brett. He said that his partner's seat was revoked before it ever existed. He added that Brett was to be escorted from the building immediately and was permanently barred from the premises. The shouting stopped. The reality settled over them like ash. The title was gone. The money was gone. The reputation was gone. All that was left was the settlement agreement on the table and the daughter they had underestimated standing at the head of it. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum created by the sudden collapse of a lifetime of lies. Brett stood frozen near the door, blocked by Vaughn's imposing frame. He looked back at me, his eyes searching for some sign that this was a joke, that I was still the little sister who could be bullied into fixing his mistakes. He opened his mouth to speak, to invoke his status as the heir apparent, but I cut him off before he could inhale. I stood up from the head of the table. I smoothed my blazer, looked him directly in the eye, and delivered the line that finally ended his mythology. "Actually, you are fired." I did not shout. I said it with the same casual finality one uses to order coffee. Brett recoiled as if I had struck him. I turned to Vaughn and clarified the consequences so there would be no ambiguity. I instructed him to process the termination immediately. I ordered a formal notice of separation to be filed with the state. I requested that Brett's building access be revoked within the hour, and that a permanent do not engage instruction be flagged across the firm's entire security network. Brett looked at Calvin, waiting for the countermand. Calvin's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He stepped toward me, his finger raised in a trembling hook. He tried to play his last card, the one he had held over my head since I was a child. He threatened me with family exile. He told me that if I walked out of this room after doing this, I was no longer in Adams. He said I would be cut off from the family trust, from the holidays, from the very name itself. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a wave of genuine pity. He did not understand that exile only works as a threat when the person you are banishing still wants to live in the house you are kicking them out of. "I am not being exiled, Dad," I said softly. "I am resigning," Marjorie hissed from her chair. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. She told me I would regret this. She said I would come crawling back when the power went to my head, and I realized I was all alone. But her voice shook. It lacked the sharp, imperious edge it usually carried. She was shaking because she was finally speaking to someone she could not control. She realized that the invisible support staff had just become the landlord. I picked up the settlement agreement and tapped it against the table. I delivered the final terms. I told them I would stabilize the damage. I would cover the funds Brett had stolen from Calvin's friends, treating it as a private loan to the estate rather than a criminal theft. I would prevent lawsuits. I would keep the firm's restructuring quiet to protect their social standing in the community, but I would only do it under strict conditions. I offered Calvin and Marjorie a narrow, realistic path. It was a path of dignity without domination. It was help without entitlement. It was peace, but it came with the price of access to my life. I told them that from this day forward, our relationship would be managed through legal counsel. No more Sunday dinners where I served as the punchline. No more emergency phone calls to fix Brett's disasters. Brett began to cycle through the stages of grief in rapid motion. First, he begged. He clasped his hands and asked me to just give him a probationary period. Then, when I did not blink, he raged. He called me names that would have made me cry 10 years ago, but now just sounded like noise. Then he pleaded again, cycling through every mask he owned. The charmer, the victim, the bully, none of them fit anymore. I watched him struggle, and I decided to deliver the final twist. I wanted them to understand that this was not a negotiation. I told them that when I purchased the debt obligations for Garnett and Rowe, I did not just buy the leverage, I purchased a specific clause in the governance documents. I revealed that the papers I signed 48 hours ago included a provision that made today's outcome irreversible. The clause stated that any executive officer found to have submitted falsified compliance data would have their employment status converted to terminated for cause instantly upon discovery. I told Brett that it was already done. The moment Vaughn flagged the metadata, the system had fired him automatically. I could not undo it, even if I wanted to. Brett slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the carpet, a heap of expensive fabric and ruined potential. Calvin sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. Marjorie just stared at the wall, unable to look at any of us. I picked up my bag. I did not say goodbye. There was no need. The silence said everything that needed to be said. I walked past Vaughn, who gave me a sharp, respectful nod. I walked past Alyssa, who closed her files with a snap. I walked past my brother, who was weeping on the floor of the conference room he thought he would rule. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked through the lobby. The receptionist looked up and smiled, unaware that the entire hierarchy of the building had just been decapitated. I walked out the front doors and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the Maryland afternoon. The air felt different. It filled my lungs in a way it never had before. I checked my pulse. It was steady. I did not look back at the building. I did not look back at the window where I knew my mother was probably watching me walk away. I did not look back. Not because I was cold, and not because I was angry. I did not look back because I finally understood the truth. I was not leaving my family behind. I was leaving a cage. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on how Riley handled her family. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lucy Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story get recommended to more people.